Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and in Yirtzeh Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Aleph. We actually pick up today on Kuf Tzadik Amid Beis at the top line of the Mechaber with Siman Shin Mem Sif Hey. However, we have done 90%, 95% of the Mishnah Berurah on Kuf Tzadik Amid Beis, and there's very little Mishnah Berurah on Kuf Tzadik Amid Aleph. So Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Aleph. So we're in good shape. Hopefully we'll complete Kuf Tzadik Amid Beis as well as Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Aleph. Our learning today should be Yoschos for Achenu Beis Yisrael and the Sunnah Batzara by Shivya Ha'imdem Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha Hamakom Yerachim Aleim V'Yitzia Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afela L'Oira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta B'Gala V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be Yoschos Refuah Shalema for Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Chavadasa Basero Rivka Bashir Leah and Yeshua Levi Ben Ahuva Malka Chana Gila Shifra Bas Ilan Udal. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Ser Shar Chayle Yisrael. Okay, so we learned a halacha yesterday, a couple of days ago, in Sif Daled, where the Mechaber told us that he brought down a Trumas Hadeshen. The Lashon of the Mechaber is Yesh Li Zoher. I mentioned then that the Lashon of the Trumas Hadeshen himself is actually a stronger Lashon. His Lashon is Tzarech Li Zoher. Pardon me for just 1 second. I see that my lighting was not proper. Okay, there we go. That's better. So the Trumas Hadeshen himself had said, Tzarech li Zaher, and we saw that the Mechaber is telling us you're not allowed to dip your finger into a liquid and then use your wet finger to draw characters, to draw letters on the table. Now, when you do that, you are writing with something that is something that is not miskayim. This is not going to it's not going to result in any kind of a lasting mark. You're just taking a damp finger and making marks with it on the table. That's certainly not a davar shemiskayim. Yet, we saw in the Mechaber that is usher. We're going to see a Mechaber now that at face value, we're going to look at it and say, why isn't this a stira? But we will resolve it very simply and very quickly. So says the Mechaber here in Sefei on Kuf Tzadik Amid Beis, Mutter l'rshaim b'tzipeiren al hasefer. You're allowed to take your nail and make a mark on the paper of your sefer. So when you push down with your nail, you make a little bit of an impression in the paper. Says the Mechaber, Mutter l'rshaim b'tzipeiren al hasefer. You're allowed to make a mark with your nail. Now, I just should mention right away, because, you always have to worry. Somebody turns on the share, he listens to a half a sentence, and then he turns it off. We're going to see that you're not allowed to do this on paper. The Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that this was talking about cloth. This was talking about parchment. But in any case, the Mechaber says that you would be allowed to take your nail and make a mark with your nail on the parchment, kimoi sharoishmin l'siman, the way that people will go ahead and make a little mark just to make a siman, just to, mark a line. Like the Mishnah Berurah will say, sometimes people make a little line nowadays, pens and inks. Ink is a dime a dozen. It's no biggie. It's not expensive. Everybody has a pen, a disposable pen. So you just click and you make a mark if you want to make a mark. Back then, they didn't have that. So if somebody wanted to make a mark on the side of the sefer to mark where he's up to, or he wanted to make a mark to show that there's maybe something wrong in the text, and he wants to make a little bit of a notation, he could take his fingernail and just make a little line, make a little dash using his fingernail. Says the Mechaber, you're allowed to do this. Why are you allowed to do this, says the Mechaber? Shein zeh davar hamiskayim. Because it's not a davar hamiskayim. That mark is not going to have any permanence to it. It's not going to last, and therefore the Mechaber says this is mutter. Now again, this would seem to fly a little bit in the face of what we learned in Sif Daled. In Sif Daled, right, the wet finger is also, it's not a davar hamiskayim, and yet we said that that's usher. Over here we're saying the mark with the fingernail is mutter because it's not a davar hamiskayim. So obviously we have to reconcile this. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is Karachav Gimel. Mutter. So first of all, the Mishnah Berurah says right away, V'yesh machmirin bazeh v'ayin bebiar halacha. There are those that dispute this psak. There are those that hold that this would be an issa d'Rabbanan and ayin sham in this lengthy biar halacha dibra maschel mutter on Kut Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chav Daled Lirshaim Bitzipirin. You're allowed to make a mark with your fingernail. So first of all, says the Mishnah Berurah, and here's where we begin to reconcile the stira. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'dafka rishima ke'in kav ba'alma lizikarin. When the Mechaber is saying that you're allowed to do this, a linchpin in this heter is the fact that all you're doing is making a little bit of an impression of a line. You're not making a letter. You're not making a symbol. You're just making a simple little line. Sheyesh bazeh ezet taz sofer. Maybe you want to mark a typo. So you make a little line with your fingernail. Umishom deloi choshev ksav klal belav hachi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you want to know why this is mutter? This is mutter because over here there are two tzadim lahakel. Over here there are two reasons to be makel. There are two mitigating factors. Mitigating factor number one is what the Mechaber mentions. He says this is a davar she'eino miskayim. But mitigating factor number two is that this is not really a ksiva. All you're doing is making a line. A line is not a bona fide ksiva. In Sif Dalid, it's true that you're writing with a wet finger, which is a davar she'eino miskayim, and that's a mitigating factor. But over there, the Mechaber was talking about where you're writing letters. So you don't have the second mitigating factor. Over there, you're doing a real bona fide ksiva in that you're actually writing a letter. The only tzad to be makel is the fact that it's a davar she'eino miskayim. Says the Mechaber, that's also that remains an issa d'Rabbanan. Over here, we have two mitigating factors. One is, it's not really a ksiva. It's just a line. That's not really a ksiva. Mitigating factor number two, it's a davar she'eino miskayim, and that's why the Mechaber holds that this is mutter. Again, the Mishnah Berurah Chav Gimel brings down the biur halacha, and in the biur halacha he discusses those shitas that are machmer and hold that this is an issa d'Rabbanan. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, Valasis kimin ois, but you want to use your fingernail and scratch out a letter. You want to make an aleph. Vade also afilu ba'is akas. Even to do that with only one letter would definitely be an issa d'Rabbanan. Ois kan chav hey. The Mechaber said that the mitigating factor over here is she'ein zeh davar hamiskayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'dafka b'klaf hakoshe. This mitigating factor, that the impression that you make with your fingernail is a davar she'eino miskayim, says the Chavetz Chaim, that's true by klaf. Parchment is tough, so a little mark that you make is not going to last. The bizmanam hayu kaisven ala klaf. The Mechaber doesn't mention that he was talking about klaf, but that's because that was the default position. That's what they wrote on back in the day. Aval al haniyar, but on paper like we have, also it would certainly be also to miskayimhu, because on the relatively soft paper that we have, if you make an impression with your fingernail that is a davar hamiskayim, it will last. And continues the Mishnah Berurah, another thing he points out, v'dafka b'tzipirin, this heter, even on klaf, this heter is only if you're making the impression with your fingernail. Avalim roishim be'ezek kli sha'oiser rishima amuka yoiser. But if you use some kind of a utensil, let's say you use an awl. If you use a utensil, a keli, that's going to make a deep impression that is going to last, afal klav ve'etz aser dimin karhetiv u'miskayim. Then this would be aser even on klaf, on parchment, or even on wood. Because if you're using a keli already to make a deep impression, that is a davar hamiskayim. Okay, now we move along to Sivav. And in Sivav and in Siv Zayin, we're going to be discussing primarily the malacha of toifer, the malacha of sewing. Now, I think it's kedai to give a little bit of a primer or a background over here into the halachas of toifer. So first of all, you should realize that toifer is one of the lamites malachas. Where did you have toifer in the malachas hamishkan? Very simple. The Mishkan was covered with urios. It was covered with tapestries. Those urios were made out of several sections. It was not one continuous piece of cloth. It was woven in sections, and then the sections were stitched together into sets. Usually, you had half of the covering of the Mishkan, the sections were stitched together into one set. The other half of the covering, those sections were stitched into one set. And then at the middle, they were joined using some kind of a clasp, using loops and hooks. But the two sections, the two halves, were made out of multiple sections that were stitched together. So that's where you're at Teifer in the Malachas HaMishkan, and Teifer is one of the Lamites Avos Malachis. Now, we're going to see that in order to be Chayev a Korban Chatos, should you do the Malach of Teifer b'Shoyeg, like all Malachas, there's a minimum shear. You have to accomplish a certain amount. There's a minimum act that you have to do in order to be over the Issa Daraisa of Teifer to the extent that you would have to bring a Korban Chatos. And many people are familiar with the terminology that the shear is shtei tefiros. Now, in English, they generally translate shtei tefiros as 2 stitches. But that is not true. That is a misnomer, and it leads many people to make a very basic mistake in the malacha of Teifer. It is not 2 stitches. Shtei tefiros really means 2 passes of the needle. So I have a piece of fabric over here, and I have a thread going through it. Now, if you look at the back here, okay, here's your thread. So at one point, there was a needle on one side of the thread. Now we took the needle and passed it. I have 2 fabrics here. So we took the needle and pushed it through both fabrics. That's one pass in the needle where we pushed the thread from the underside up to the top. Then we traveled across and then pushed the needle back through both fabrics from the top to the bottom. So now we have 2 passes of the needle, and those 2 passes of the needle create what we would call 1 stitch. That, Rabbi Isai, is shtei tefiros. It's 2 stitches of the needle, which makes what we would call 1 stitch. Now, what did you accomplish by doing this? And why is this one of the Avos Malachas? The answer is that it's not so much the creation of the stitch that is the Av Malacha of Teifer, as much as the Av Malacha of Teifer is using the stitch to join 2 fabrics together. We had 2 fabrics, and by virtue of the 2 passes of the needle and the stitch that we created, we have now attached the 2 fabrics together. That is the Av Malacha of Teifer. Now, we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah that the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, if this is all you did, if what you did was the bare minimum of Teifer, 2 passes of the needle, then there's another step that you really have to take for this to be an Issa Daraisa, and that is you have to take the ends of the thread, the loose ends of the thread, and you have to tie knots in them. Because without knots in them, it's very simple to just pull this thread right out. It's also very simple to just take the 2 pieces of fabric and pull them apart. I'm going to start pulling it apart, right? You start pulling it apart. Since the thread is loose here on the bottom, there's nothing holding it in. You could very simply just pull these 2 pieces of fabric apart. Therefore, this stitch and the attachment of the 2 fabrics that are made by the stitch is very impermanent. It doesn't have any permanence to it at all. It's not really a davar hamiskayim, and the attachment is not really an attachment because it'll just come apart. So the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us, as much as we say that the Av Malacha of Teifer is the minimum, is shtei tefiros, 2 passes of the needle, but you do have to make knots in the open ends of the thread so that the thread can't simply pull out. Now, right away, when I tell you that you have to make knots, you're thinking to yourself, well, if you're going to make knots, you're going to come up against another one of the Lamites Malachas, you're going to come up against kosher. Well, that's true if you make a kesher shakayama. But if you don't make a kesher shakayama, yeah, it could be we have a drabanan issue, but if it's completely not a kesher shakayama, if it's not the type of knot that would be a kesher shakayama, and you didn't tie it with any kavana for permanence, right? So you could avoid the kosher issue. But even a kesher she'eino shel kayama that's on the ends of these threads would be enough to turn this into teifer. Why is that? There's different opinions on why that is. Again, what I'm saying is a little bit of a chiddush, right? What I'm telling you is the reason you need the knots is because without the knots, there's no kayama. This stitch, this attachment is not shel kayama. So in order to make it shel kayama, you need the knots. Yet, even if you use a kesher she'ena shel kayama on those threads, it's still enough to make it a teifer, to make it tefira, and to give it enough permanence that you're going to be over the av malacha of teifer. Why is that? It could be because now you have the combination of the stitch and the kesher that's eina shel kayama. But you've got two things working together to make the attachment, and that's enough. Okay. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us also, the Mishnah Berurah is going to go a little bit further. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say that this that I just told you, that you need knots on the open end of the thread, is only when you have the absolute minimum of shtei tfiros, 2 passes of the needle. But let's say you have 3 passes of the needle, which brings me to the other side of the fabric. Over here, what I did was, we have the thread, right? Here's one end of the thread on the underside. Here's the other end of the thread on the top side of the 2 fabrics. Over here, the needle passed from the bottom up to the top. It went across to form 1 stitch. Then it penetrated again. That's the second pass of the needle to the underside. Then it went across over here, and it made a 3rd pass through the 2 fabrics back up to the top. And it made what we would call 2 stitches. 1 stitch here on the top, 1 stitch here on the bottom. So this is what we would call gimel tfiros. This is 3 passes of the needle. 3 passes of the needle equals what we would call 2 stitches. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that once you have 2 stitches, once you have 3 passes of the needle, now you no longer need knots in order to be over teifer. Why? Because once you have 2 complete stitches, the attachment that's made by the stitches is a firmer attachment than when you only have 1 stitch, and it's a firm enough attachment that you don't need the knots on the open ends of the threads in order to hold it together, in order to be over the malacha of teifer. Okay, I'll point out one more thing that comes up right at the beginning of Sivav, just so that we understand it. I mentioned to you in the course of this introduction to teifer that when we talk about the av malacha of teifer, it's not so much the creation of the stitches that is the malacha. It's the attachment of the 2 fabrics that is the malacha. The tzuras hamalacha, the way you do the malacha of teifer, generally, is with stitching. But the point of the malacha, the thing that is actually forbidden by the malacha, is attaching the 2 fabrics together. And that's why you could be over the malacha of teifer without a needle and thread. So, for example, if the page of the Mishnah Berurah is torn, and you take a piece of Scotch tape and you attach the 2 sides of the torn paper together using Scotch tape, that Rabbi say is teifer. What? It's not sewing. I didn't sew anything. Doesn't matter, because it's not the sewing. It's not the creation of the stitches that is the malacha of teifer. It's the attachment of the 2 pieces together that is the malacha of teifer. And therefore, you could be over teifer with tape. You could be over teifer with glue. It doesn't have to be a needle and thread. So again, the point over here is the attachment that you are making. Now, against that backdrop, in the beginning of Siv Vav, the Mechaber is going to start off this discussion of teifer with a very interesting halacha. Back here, the first simple stitch that we started this discussion with, we have 2 passes of the needle, and we have 1 stitch that is stitching these 2 pieces of fabric together. Now, I showed you earlier that when all you have is 1 stitch and you don't have any knots on the open ends of the thread, look what you could do. You could simply pull the 2 pieces of fabric apart, right? You pull the 2 pieces of fabric apart, the thread starts to come out, the stitch gets very loose, and now the 2 pieces of fabric are separated. Now, what happens if you want these two pieces of fabric together and you encounter this on Shabbos? Well, you might think they're very easy fix. All I have to do is take the two open sides of the thread and pull them. By pulling them, I just pulled the stitch tight. I pulled it taut. Now, the two pieces of fabric are pulled back together again. The Mechaber is going to say that would be usher. Why? Because of Teifer. You didn't make a stitch. The stitch was already there. You didn't pass the needle through and back. You didn't make shtei tfiros. But you accomplished Teifer. Because you used the stitch, you pulled the stitch tight in order to pull the fabrics together. That, says the Mechaber, Asr Mishum Teifer. That is Teifer. You're not allowed to do that. Now, the truth is, there's a very practical application of this. And I've seen, unfortunately, people do this on Shabbos, and you're not allowed to do it. You have a button that gets loose on Shabbos, and it's hanging, and you want to tighten it. Now, you know you can't sew it, Teifer, right? But they go to the back, and they find on the back where the button is sewn on. They go to the back, right? With a stitch, you're not going to be able to see it over here. Actually, you might be able to see it because there's actually a hanging thread, right? I don't know if the camera picked that up. But right over here, there's a hanging thread. They go to the back side of where the button is stitched on, and they take that thread and they pull it. And by pulling the thread, they're taking the stitching that is stitching the button on, and they're pulling it tight, and they're pulling the button back onto the fabric. Not allowed to do that. That's exactly what the Mechaber is talking about here. In Sivav, you're not making stitches. The stitches are already there, but you're pulling the stitches tight. And by doing that, you're fastening the thing that has to be fastened. That is Asr Mishum Teifer. Okay, that's enough for us to get started over here, and we'll do more visual cues when we need them. So, Sivav, on the bottom line of Kuf Tzadik Amud Beis, says the Mechaber, Chut shel tfira sheniftach. If the thread that is making the stitch opens up, that's, you have the loose stitch, and the two fabrics start to pull apart. So your stitching is pulling apart. Sheniftach, it's opening. Asr limaschai, you're not allowed to pull the thread and pull it tight and pull the fabrics together, Mishum Teifer, because that's Teifer. You're using the stitch in order to pull the fabric together to attach the fabric. Says the Mishnah Berurah Chavav on Kuf Tzadik Amud Beis, lemaschai. What does this mean? Hainu shenispardu shtei chatichas habeged zu mizu. The two pieces of fabric that had been stitched together are separating. They're pulling apart. B'miktsas. V'chutei atfiros demeshachin. The thread of the stitches is pulling, and it's allowing it to open. V'roitzelim toyach roish hachut. And now you want to pull the end of the thread kedei lahadek u'lechaber, in order to tighten it and attach the two pieces of fabric. You're not allowed to do this. The Mechaber said, also Mishum Teifer. Ois Kadon Chav Zayin, also Mishum Teifer, Veha Oisa Kain Chayiv Chatos. You saw the Mechaber, you saw also Mishum Teifer. You don't know what he means. It's a Drabanan, it's a Daraisa, says the Mishnah Berurah very clearly, and this is based on a Gemara, Ayin Hey Amud Aleph. It's a Beferish Gemara. Veha Oisa Kain Chayiv Chatos. This is an Issa Daraisa, because you're using the stitching to pull the two pieces of fabric together. This is an Issa Daraisa. You did it Peshagi, you'd be Chayiv Achatos. Now the Mishnah Berurah qualifies this, because again, right now the Mishnah Berurah is assuming that we're talking about the basic case of a single stitch, shtei tfiros, two passes of the needle. So says the Mishnah Berurah, V'hu she'asa hakesher lebesayf afilu eino shel kayam. This is only going to be true if you made knots on the open ends of the thread. If the open ends of the thread don't have any knots, and what happened was the fabric opened up, it started to pull apart, and now you went to the thread and you pulled the thread tight to pull them together again, you didn't accomplish anything if there are no knots in the thread, because it'll just pull apart again. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, hold it. Chayiv Chatos, it's a Daraisa. Well, that's only if you're going to go ahead and make knots. And he says, and I mentioned this, Afil Eina Shel Kayama. You don't have to make a Kesher Shel Kayama. You don't have to make permanent knots on the threads. Even if it's not a permanent knot, that's enough for this to be teifer. Ava B'loi Kesher Klal. But if there are no knots, potter, then it's potter. Now, potter, we know, potter avaloser. If you take a look at the Shartzin, the Mishnah Berurah brings down the Eliyah Rabbah, who says that even without the knots, it would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's an Eliyah Rabbah. It's not a Dover Muskim. The Eliyah Rabbah holds that this would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Hence, the Mishnah Berurah uses the word over here, potter, not mutter. Okay, so again, what do we have here so far? So far, Chaber didn't say it. We didn't see it yet in the Mishnah Berurah. But the minimum of teifer, 2 passes of the needle, 1 stitch. Halacha of the Mechaber, the 2 fabrics started to pull apart. It got loose. Now you're not allowed to go pull the thread to tighten it. If you pull the thread to tighten it, osir. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Issa Daraisa. When is it an Issa Daraisa? If you made knots on the open ends of the thread. If you don't make knots on the open end of the thread, it's not lasting. It could just pull apart again. Then potter. Eliyah Rabbah brought that in the Sharitzion, potter avaloser, it would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, Vim yispardu shalosh tfiros. But let's say the 2 pieces of fabric are not stitched together with 1 stitch, 2 passes of the needle. No, it's held together with 2 stitches. 1 stitch over here on the top side of the fabric, another stitch over here on the bottom side of the fabric, because you made 3 passes of the needle. So now it's gimel tfiros. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what if you had more than shtei tfiros? What if you had more than the minimum? What if you had at least gimel tfiros? You had at least 3 passes of the needle, 2 stitches, and that pulled apart. That could also start to pull apart. There you see the 3 threads that represent the 3 passes of the needle, right? The needle carried the thread through the 2 fabrics 3 times. What if that started to pull apart? And what if you then took the threads and you pulled it tight to tighten up the 2 stitches and pull the fabric back together again? Do you also need knots on the open end of the thread in order for this to be a daraisa? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Says the Mishnah Berurah, im yispardu shalosh tfiros. If 3 passes of the needle, aka 2 stitches, got loose, u'mesachon, and you pull the thread to tighten it, chayiv af b'loi kesher, then it would be an issa daraisa, it would be a chayiv chatos, even if you have no knots on the open end of the thread. Why is that? The reason is because once you have 3 passes of the needle, and once you have 2 stitches, that already holds significantly more than 1 single stitch. And therefore, you don't need knots in order for it to be enough of an attachment to be considered an Issa Daraisa. Okay, now, says the Mishnah Berurah, Va'agav, once we're here, Neva'er Tzas Din Teifer, let me explain a little bit the malacha of Teifer. HaTeifer shtei tfiros, if somebody uses 2 passes of the needle, so he creates 1 stitch, chayiv. That's an Issa Daraisa. If it's done b'shoigig, it would carry a chiv chatos. V'hu shekasha rasha echot mikan u'mikan kidei shaloi tishmait. However, like we've explained already several times, that's only true if you take the 2 opened sides, the 2 open ends of the thread, and you knot them. It doesn't mean that you knot them together. It could be you knot them together, or it could be that you make knots on each end just so that it can't pull out. So, yes, shtei tfiros, 2 passes of the needle, Issa Daraisa, chiv chatos, but only with combination of knots. Only if the thread is knotted so it can't pull out. And again, the Mishnah Berurah makes the point, but those knots do not have to be a kesher shakayama in order for the knots to contribute to make the shtei tfiros on Issa Daraisa. Now, if on Shabbos you went ahead and you made the knots and you made a kesher shakayama, chayiv gam mishum kosher. Congratulations. Now you are over on another one of the lamites malachas, the av malach of kosher. The chol zel inyan chiyuva, but this is all in the context of an Issa Daraisa and a chiv chatos. Aval inyan isura. But as far as Teifer being Aser, Yesh Oimim de Aser va'afilu lo yasa kesha klal. There are those that say, this was the El Yerabah that we saw, that there's an Issa D'Rabbanan to make Shtei Tfiros even without any knots. It's still an Issa D'Rabbanan. And now the Mishnah Berurah says something that is going to take some people by surprise, very much the Ge'al Halacha. Val Kain, and we're going to use my trusty visual aid here. Val Kain, therefore, Oisano Anoshim, those people, Shetoichevin Hakrayz im Habeged, who take a scarf or a shawl, I believe that's what a krayz is. Shetoichevin Hakrayz im Habeged, they attach it to the beged, right? You don't want to lose your scarf in the coat room, in the shul. So you want to attach the scarf to the coat. So they take the krayz, they take the shawl or the scarf, and they attach it to the beged, b'machat, with a needle. B'shtei tekifos, using 2 penetrations of the needle, lav shaper avdi. What they're doing is not proper, and the Mishnah Berurah brings this down from the Carbon Nisano. What does this mean? So first I'll show you what the Mishnah Berurah is talking about, and then I'll show you the more practical application nowadays. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is very simple. Rabbi Isai, needle. Okay, I'll hold it up against here. Maybe you can see it better. Right? I am holding a sewing needle. There you go. I have 2 pieces of fabric. One of them is going to be, let me get away from my stitches. We'll go to this side of the fabric over here. One piece of fabric is going to represent the coat. The other piece of fabric is going to represent the scarf. I take the needle, I pass it 1 time through the scarf and the shawl, and then I turn and I pass it through again, right? So basically what I'm doing is Shtei Tfiros. I'm not doing Shtei Tfiros with thread. I'm doing Shtei Tfiros with a needle. Here you see it, Rabbi Isai. You see the needle? Ta-da! This mirror imaging of the camera always gets me. Okay, see that? See the needle passing through the fabric? And it's passing through both. It's passing through the top fabric and the bottom fabric. That's the shawl and the coat. And it's passing through twice. So in essence, this is making what we would call a stitch. There you see it, right? So I'm not making a stitch using thread. I'm making a stitch using the needle. And by doing that, by passing the needle through the coat and the scarf and passing it through twice, I'm essentially stitching the scarf to the coat, right? I'm stitching it with Shtei Tfiros. So I'm attaching it with Shtei Tfiros, with 2 passes of the needle. Well, says the Mishnah Berurah, you don't know how to do that. He says, what is that similar to? Well, that, says the Mishnah Berurah, is exactly similar to going ahead and making 2 passes of the needle with the thread and not knotting, and not making any knots on the open ends of the thread. What's the difference? Here we have a stitch made out of thread, and at the open end, it's not knotted together. Well, here we have a stitch made with a needle, 2 passes through the fabrics with the needle, and there's no knots on the ends of the needle, right? But what's the difference? What is the difference between those 2 cases? So says the Mishnah Berurah, well, according to this Shita, Carbon Nisano, not allowed to do this. And the Mishnah Berurah is machriya that way. Lav shaper avdi. It's not right what they're doing. He doesn't go so far as saying, Rabbi say it's aser, but he says lav shaper avdi. What they're doing is not proper. They shouldn't do this. Now I said, I'll show you the more practical application of this. Nobody nowadays really does this. They don't take just a needle and pass it through to lock something together. But Rabbi say they do this. What's that? That's a safety pin. Now, a safety pin is even worse because a safety pin is no longer like this case. It's not the case of 1 stitch and the open ends of the thread don't have knots in them, so you could simply pull it out. The safety pin, where the pin of the safety pin makes 2 passes through the needle, through the fabric, like this does, right? You see it penetrates the fabrics twice, and then it locks in a clasp. So this is worse than 1 stitch with no knots. This is more like 1 stitch with knots. This can't come out. So according to this Mishnah Berurah, to take a safety pin and pin something to a garment, right? You want to pin the scarf to the garment, or to pin up a hem with a safety pin on Shabbos with 2 passes of the needle, shtei tkifos, shtei tfiros. According to this Mishnah Berurah, it would be aser. Now, that's the opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. We're saying a Mishnah Berurah shir. However, many contemporary poskim do not agree with this. The Rishiva Zatzal, Rav Moshe Zechatzak Levracha, did not agree with this. The Rishiva writes in a tshuva that you cannot compare the use of a safety pin to stitching. And his primary argument is that the use of a safety pin and stitching are not even remotely similar. Stitching is done to turn 2 things into one. It's to attach them, right? I am not wearing, oh wow, look at those beautiful 17 different pieces of fabric that Rabbi Weiss is wearing. No, I'm wearing one bekisha. I'm not wearing 17 pieces of fabric, right? Now, it's made out of many different pieces of fabric, but it's all stitched together into one, right? That's what it is. That's not what a safety pin does. A safety pin attaches 2 distinct things together. Even the hem. You're going to look at me and you say, well, the hem, it's not 2 different things. It is. It's 2 different ends of the fabric that we pin together. But it's not sewing it together to make it one. And it's also distinctly intended to be temporary, even if you leave it there for a long time. But again, safety pins do not make permanent connections. They make temporary connections. The Rishiva Zatzal held that the use of a safety pin is more akin to closing a button or something like that. And therefore, he had no problem with it. But according to this Mishnah Berurah, it would be a problem. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah. How about if you make 3 passes of the needle, aka 2 stitches? Chayav af bali kesher. Then it's definitely an issa daraisa chayav chatos, even without knots on the open ends of the thread. Sharei miskayemes hatfira, because once you have 2 stitches, 3 passes of the needle, that already has enough permanence to be an issa daraisa, even without knots. Let's go weiter. This is a very interesting halacha. Also has a lot of ramifications nowadays. This is going to be the question of a drawstring. Now, what's a drawstring? So a drawstring, typically, you have multiple openings in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber is going to discuss a sleeve. So let's say you have a sleeve. This sleeve is very loose. Let's say you want a sleeve to be tight. So you have multiple openings going around the sleeve, and you have a thread or a strap that goes in and out, in and out, in and out, the way stitches do. And it has 2 ends that hang loose, the string, and you pull it. When you pull it, what are you doing? When you're pulling it, essentially what you're doing is you're stitching closed the fabric, right? You're pulling the fabric together using essentially stitches, right? Essentially, that's what the drawstring does. The drawstring goes in and out, in and out, in and out. Those are essentially stitches. When you pull it tight. You know what this is? Really, this is sivav. Chutshel tvir sheniftach asur lamaschai b'shem taifer, right? I mean, this is not much different than a drawstring, right? I mean, here we have this is my 3-stitch case, my 2-stitch case. Gimel tviros. 1 stitch on the front, 1 stitch on the back. Look what happens if I take the ends and I pull it. If I take the ends this way, I take them together, and I pull, what happens? I pull this tight. I bunch the fabric together. That's what a drawstring does. So a drawstring could be used to pull a sleeve closed. Says the Mechaber, Oisam shemahadkim habegodim saviv z'roiseyim al yedei chut shemoitchen oisayum ishadek. Those who have a sleeve and it has a drawstring, and you pull the drawstring in order to tighten the sleeve, also l'mascha, you're not allowed to pull it to draw it closed. Elo im kain yihiu hanekavim rechavim. In order for this to be mutter, the holes that the drawstring go through have to be relatively wide, umisukanim bitfira beigel, and the holes have to be stitched. They have to be buttonholed. It can't be a raw hole. They have to be somewhat wide so that it's somewhat loose for the drawstring to pull. And the holes have to be buttonholed. They have to be stitched around. If that's the way it is, it becomes mutter. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. So right away, like I said, we can understand what the Isser over here is. The Isser over here is essentially sivav. That's what the Isser is. You have this drawstring that essentially creates stitches, and now you're pulling it to tighten it. When you're pulling it to tighten it, you're pulling the ends of the fabric together, and you're attaching them, so to speak, in order to close it up to make the sleeve tight. So that's what the Isser is based on. Says the Mishnah Berurah, they would put a thread or a string through the sleeve, so that when they wanted to tighten it, they would pull the drawstring, and it would get nice and tight. It wouldn't just, as soon as you let go, bounce back open again. If it did that, there would be no tzad really to aser it. The only reason we could aser it is because it's mishadik heitev. When you pull it, it gets tight and it stays tight, so you're forming an attachment, right? You're pulling the fabric together and you're attaching the different parts of the fabric together using stitching. So you're pulling the stitches closed. That's what the Isser would be based on. But the Mechaber said if they're rechavim tzas umesukanim, if the holes that the drawstring go through are somewhat large, rechavim tzas, they're somewhat wide, umesukanim, and they're stitched around, then it's mutter. Why is it mutter? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. Da'az einoi doime klal l'toifer. Once the holes are somewhat wide and loose, and once they're stitched, it no longer is toifer. The heavy command the macht is crossing belula'is. Now it's like loops and hooks. Now it's like buttons. Kevin the mesukin lazeh betmidus, since it's made this way, so that it could be used this way all the time. Limaschai, to pull it, ulahadkai, and to tighten it, kishalovshai, when you put it on. V'chein l'rapoisai, and then to loosen it, kisharoitza l'pashtai, when you want to take it off. So you're right, you're forming an attachment. But guess what? When you button your jacket or your shirt or your bekisha, when you button it closed, you're also making an attachment. Is that teifer? Is that also on Shabbos Mishum teifer? No, it's not. Why? Because it's derech tashmishoy bekach. This is like a door that's made to open and close. This is not forming an attachment on Shabbos. No, this is made to be closed and then it's made to be open. So too explains the Mishnah Berurah. When you have the drawstring and the holes that the drawstring go through are somewhat wide and loose and they're stitched out, it's very clear that these are not stitches. It's very clear that this is something that's made to be tightened. When you put it on, you make it tight, and then it's made to be loosened when it's time to get undressed and to take it off. Therefore, it's not the malacha of teifer. The malacha of teifer is forming a connection, to attaching two things. This is not called attaching two things. This is meant to be pulled together and then to be opened up. So this is not the malacha of teifer. But now the Mishnah Berurah goes into a little bit like a gray area here. But let's say what you do is you take the drawstring and you pull it, but you don't make it too tight. And what you like to do is, you like to pull the drawstring closed, but not too tight. You know why? Because you want to be able to take your hand out of the sleeve, even when it's tied closed. And what you want to do is, you want to tighten it somewhat, and then you want to leave it that way. You're not going to open it and close it, and open it and close it, and open it and close it. No, you're going to pull it closed, just enough that it should be considered closed, and you're going to leave it that way. And you're going to put it on and off while it is that way. I know people who tie their shoes that way. They tie their shoes somewhat loose, and they use their lace-up shoe like a slip-on. I could never do that. I like my shoe tight. If I have a lace shoe, I want it tight. So I have to open up my laces in order to take my foot out, and I got to open up my laces to put my foot in. Some people, they tie their shoe, they keep it somewhat loose, and they shove their foot in, they pull their foot out all the time. So too with the blouse or the shirt. They leave it somewhat loose, and they leave it that way. In that case, the Mishnah Berurah says, now you have a problem. Also, lahatke b'Shabbos. Then Yutaka would not be allowed to tie it on Shabbos, because now it ceases to be a button. Now, mind you, a button is not that way. Give you a very practical application. You have an all-weather coat that you wear during the spring and the fall, and it has a lining in it that zippers up. You're allowed to use a zipper. A zipper is not considered teufer. For the same reason that this is not considered teufer, the zipper is also not considered teufer. The zipper is not intended to form a permanent connection. It's made to be open and closed, taken out, put in, taken out, put in. Now, you're allowed to zipper in your lining, even if you're going to leave it in for 3 months. You're allowed to zipper it in on Shabbos. And we don't say, oh, now you made a connection, you're not allowed to do it. But over here, that's not what we're saying. Over here, by this drawstring, we're saying that if you pull the drawstring closed somewhat, and you tie it and you intend to leave it there, then you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. What's the difference? The difference is that by the drawstring is mamish stitches. That's what it is. It is stitches. So the line at which it ceases to be stitches and it becomes like buttons or hooks or a zipper, there's a line where it becomes that way and a line where it doesn't become that way. Like the Mechaber. The Mechaber made a line. The Mechaber said if the holes are loose and the holes are stitched out, then okay, then it's like buttons, then it's like a zipper, then it's mutter. The Mishnah Berurah is tightening it up a little bit more, no pun intended. The Mishnah Berurah is saying there's another point, and that is that, yeah, kol zman, you're in the habit. You open it, you close it, you open it, you close it, and it's loose, and it's stitched out, then it's not a problem. But if you leave it there, if you tie it and you leave it tight, and you don't open it and close it, open it and close it, open it and close it, then even if the holes are a little bit wide, and even if it's stitched out, it really is stitches, right? And you're leaving it that way. You leave it that way all the time. Then it does become a problem, says the Mishnah Berurah. Let's do just this last Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut limud, b'tfira, if the holes are stitched out like buttonholes, savev hanekev, v'az afilu achot tachav b'machat nekuva shu talisha between us kedei lachnisai al yodai b'hanikavim shari. He adds in another point to the Mishnah Berurah, and he says that in the case where it's mutter, when you have the somewhat wide holes that are stitched out and you open it and close it all the time, sometimes they would take a needle, like a sewing needle, and they would tie it to the threads, or 2 of them, and leave them hanging there to use all the time for the pulling and everything else. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that would be okay. Shari, that's mutter. If it ain't by mishum tiltel, it wouldn't be an isser tiltel muktzah. We wouldn't look at those sewing needles as being a klisha malachtil isser. No, they become part of the beged. Kevin shamacha toli b'psilva beged vein nifred b'men lo'ilam. It's bottled to the beged. It would be mutter to go out with it on Shabbos. It wouldn't be a shaila of hitzah, and there's no shaila of tiltel muktzah. It becomes part of the beged. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua's refuahs parnas and shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu amen. Be well.